This morning, our topic is much ado about autopsies. Um, and we're ripping from the headlines, and we're also going to have an example of the more things change, the more they stay the same. And this is a story which broke a couple of weeks ago in Israel. Source number one from Times of Israel on February 6th. Protests broke out in Jerusalem and Beit Shemesh with hundreds of ultra-Orthodox Jews blocking roads and clashing with police. The demonstrations were sparked by the announcement that the body of a 13-year-old boy who died this morning under unclear circumstances in Beit Shemesh would undergo an autopsy, a procedure considered taboo by Orthodox Jews. According to police, the demonstrators started fires, damaged bus windows, threw eggs and bottles, and attacked police officers, leading to at least 5 arrests as of this afternoon. Protests continued through the evening, with protesters blocking buses at a major intersection on Yirmiyahu Street in Jerusalem. So there's tension. Obviously, there's a lot of sadness at the passing of a 13-year-old boy who passed away under unclear circumstances. Authorities feel autopsy is warranted, and this is something considered taboo. So there's a protest. It turns ugly, it turns messy, it turns violent. Thinking today's actually a municipal election day in Israel, and the democracy at work, and sometimes the protests get a little angry and violent. And Israel is a place where people are not shy about advocating for and sharing their opinions, and this was what was encountered. The ideology behind it was mentioned by a Haredi rabbi, source number 2. Yesterday, a magistrate allowed the autopsy in light of a request by police due to suspicious evidence found on the body. The family appealed, and today the Supreme Court will hear the appeal. Rabbi Shraga Brand, a prominent figure in the Eidah Haredi sect, explained the issue to Kol Barama. We are protesting against the court. We cannot permit an autopsy. The teen did not feel well, and the police know that. The court is ignoring the rights of the deceased. And this is something that can be encountered anytime that an autopsy is desired or requested or sometimes mandated. In general, I think, as we mentioned in the questions leading up to the class, we know that kavod hames, respecting the remains of the deceased, is a priority. We're going to have to explore that a little bit in terms of the origins of that. And so therefore, we don't want to do anything that would defile or deface or do anything to minimize that respect. You don't do anything to the body. Just a couple of examples of how this becomes applicable. It's very possible that the whole myth of someone with a tattoo not being buried in a Jewish cemetery emerges from this idea. Because that person has defiled or defaced their body with a tattoo, and that's a terrible offense. And since they've committed that offense to themselves, we don't want them in a cemetery. Something we saw in the previous year. But the idea of, for example, even organ donation is discussed within this context. Organ donation is something we've seen very often, tragically, after IDF soldiers are killed in action and their organs are donated to other people. One of the objections, or one of the possible objections to organ donation, is the fact that you are defiling or defacing the body. You're taking organs out, so the body's not complete. In that situation, often the discussion is that missing organs is not considered a violation of this nivul hames, of desecrating the body, but it's something that is raised as a possibility. On some level, the idea of an autopsy, sometimes autopsies are done and you can sew up the remains afterwards. That doesn't seem to necessarily blunt any of the religious opposition. Neither does for trying to find out the cause of death. Right, the authorities want to find out the cause of death. Maybe there's a pathogen, maybe there's a disease, maybe there's something that's going around through the whole family. They seem to have compelling reasons for doing it. And the religious community, in this case, is objecting. Right, sometimes we encounter this even in the United States. There are times when rabbis have to get involved with the medical examiner's office to protest against, or to stop an autopsy, or to have it done in as minimally invasive a way as possible, or to do it in such a way that causes less nivul hames. Nivul hames, the desecration of the body at play. And sometimes the authorities are pushing for autopsies, even if it doesn't seem to necessarily seem to be as pressing. Like we said, sometimes to figure out the cause of death. In general, if at least it's been in this rabbi's experience, if someone passes away at home, even someone very elderly in their 90s, but the family would call 911 to respond to that passing, or the individual is no longer breathing. Sometimes that activates a major police response with a desire to investigate. And you kind of wonder, it's a 95-year-old person, what's there to investigate? But it can get, sometimes there's an overzealousness on the part of the authorities for the autopsy. And it seems that there's a very zealous response here on the part of the community not to do an autopsy and to accuse the authorities of already knowing the reason. The authorities say, well, we don't know the reason. There are suspicions, situations you want to rule out any types of malfeasance, any types of abuse, any types of other possible variables. And so, they're willing to set the whole state on fire in order to resist. Now, I mentioned before that the Groundhog's Day effect of the more things change, the more they stay the same. Source number 3, 20 persons injured in riot against autopsy at Israel hospital. Right? What's the date on that? 1966. So this is not a new phenomenon in Israel. It's not a new phenomenon in the religious community. Source number 3, 20 persons were injured in Kaplan Hospital near Rehovot when villagers from a Lachish settlement rioted today in protest against the performance of an autopsy in the hospital on the body of a settlement member who had died during the night. The Lachish settlement, Moshav Rechava, is made up of Kurdish Jews. Police called to the scene, fought to subdue the screaming mob, whose members assaulted the police and even patients passing by. 16 of the rioters were detained and later released on bail. Final tally of injuries came to 6 hospital employees, 5 policemen, 4 patients, 5 rioters, and a partridge in a pear tree. The autopsy was performed on Eliyahu Moshe. In the end, they did perform the autopsy. So clearly there's a lot of passion, inflamed passions around this subject. Just postscript on our story, right? Number 4, real drama in Jerusalem Supreme Court a few minutes before the start of a hearing concerning the appeal filed by the family of the boy Chaim Shmuel Whitehandler, late of Beit Shemesh, against the court's ruling last night that ordered an autopsy. The attorney's office retracts the demand for an autopsy. So in this particular case, a lot of fighting, heading for an autopsy, situation diffused, no autopsy. No further reporting that I've seen yet as to why they backed away, but in this story, case closed. So those are some of the headlines, some of the background, and I think that we're going to approach this from a couple of different halachic perspectives. One in terms of just the general idea of an autopsy, as well as a couple of rationales that could happen for an autopsy. The two that we'll end up touching upon. One has to do with criminal investigation. Someone is murdered and an autopsy is requested for trying to find the perpetrator or punish the perpetrator. And the other having to do with science and in understanding if someone dies unexpectedly, trying to find out why, in order that might help understand the issue more, which may save the lives of family members who may suffer a similar fate without this type of an intervention. Before we jump in, any questions, comments, thoughts before we tackle some of the sources?
Rabbi Pearl, prior rabbi of our synagogue, rabbi, firm believer in the ability to donate, and he had a close friend who headed an organization, was active in that capacity.
So I think that's the more accepted approach today is to permit, and in times encourage organ donation. There still is, it's a whole separate subject. There still is certain organs are more complicated than others when it comes to this, but certainly the idea of nivul hames, the idea that it would be a desecration of the remains for organ donation is no longer really the main discussion. That's kind of asked and answered. That's more settled in terms of of halacha. And I think that it becomes an evolving case, as other things we've seen. Sometimes the first time this is posed as a question becomes a major shock to the halakhic system. As you move forward, you begin to see a different, more tolerance towards further a deepening exploration of the issue, and sometimes in the conclusion. I think organ donation is one of them. We've seen a lot of that in the news in terms of in Israel, soldiers killed in action and the like. It's not a settled issue of Jewish law. There's some major controversies over the heart donation, anything that is any organs which are what they call live donation. The person has to be alive for it to be donated. Leads to difficulty when those organs that are being donated are essential, right? The heart. That's on the one hand, if the person is considered dead, taking the heart doesn't matter. But if the person is considered alive, taking the heart kills them. So that's the whole issue of what the time of death and how that would work in organ donation, which is a whole subject in and of itself. So let's dive in. Just first, this idea of this kavod hames, this nivul hames, where does it come from with regards to becoming such a central issue in Jewish law? So there's a discussion in several places in the Talmud. One has to do with a Gemara in Baba Basra, where they talk about a dispute that might be able to be resolved by investigating the corpse after it was buried. We know the idea of proper burial, proper funeral, right? Levaya, kivura, funeral and burial. These are mitzvos. We know that kavod hames is part of the preparation, the chever kadisha process, but nivul hames as being as being a mitzvah, for lack of a better term. Where does that come from? So Rabbi Moshe Sofer, the Chassam Sofer, discusses this subject in one of his tshuvos, source number 5, where he explains the concept. Non-Jews think that when a soul departs from the body is then void of any trace of spirituality. Therefore, they dissect it and are concerned about its disgrace. Jews, however, believe that when a man dies in a tent, quoting the verse that we read in the Torah, Adam ki amus ba'ohel, even when he dies, he is called a man. He's called Adam, and not just a mere corpse. For a body that had been attached to a soul remains with a trace of holiness, and therefore we must treat it with respect. The idea comes from that there is a certain holiness that we've attached to the corpse, to the remains. We acknowledge, and that requires respect, both in terms of burial and also extends to not dissecting a corpse, not to treat it just as a hunk of flesh. It's something that has a certain lingering spiritual significance afterwards. So if you want to just look at a corpse as a corpse, and then therefore then you'll dissect it. However, Rabbi Sofer says that's not how Judaism looks at it. There's a certain spirituality still connected, and that's why we don't just dissect it. Now, it doesn't say it's forbidden at all times to dissect it, but that shapes conceptually how we look at the corpse. Therefore, what happens when the question comes up, if there's some sort of rationale for an autopsy, or as Rabbi Sofer calls it, dissecting? So one of the first responses to deal with this was source number 6, right? Response of Rabbi Yedidia Tia Weil. We're talking now in the 17th century. The Rabbi Yedidia Weil was the son of Rabbi Nesanel Weil. Nesanel Weil was the Karba Nesanel, for those who study the Rush on the Talmud. So that this is his son. And he was asked about a situation about where there was a desire to dig up the corpse and examine the corpse in order to try and identify the murderer. And so it was the non-Jewish authorities who wanted to do this to try and investigate the crime. And on the one hand, you might be able to find the criminal, bring him to justice. On the other, you'd have to do an autopsy. So he concludes by saying, he says, look, respecting the remains is more significant. It's even more important than finding the murderer and bringing the murderer to justice. Look, it's over. The person is physically gone. Don't reopen the situation and desecrate the remains in order to find the murderer. The only time we would, talk about nivul allowing it would be if it would save somebody. But just in general, even if you can think of a compelling rationale, like investigating the case, that's not enough. So that was Rabbi Weil's approach to it. Later on, in the 19th century, Rabbi Makil Tannenbaum was asked a similar situation. They found someone dead, and there's an assumption, or there's a suspicion that it was a non-Jew, a Gentile, who killed him. Can they bring a case in the court on this Gentile? We can make a claim, we can bring a criminal complaint, but that would open up a process of opening the grave and investigating the cause of death. So Rabbi Tannenbaum continues, he says, look, you can bring the complaint, because bringing the complaint isn't digging up the body. That's going to be a function of what happens afterwards. So with regard to specifically the question of bringing a criminal complaint against a Gentile on a suspicion of murdering the Jew, that's not boshes. That's not an embarrassment to the body in and of itself. It's indirectly causing, but it's not directly causing it. Right? Maybe it won't happen. Maybe they won't end up taking him out. Why? Because maybe if the criminal, the suspect, hears about this case, he'll confess to the crime before being found guilty and get some leniency. So he says it's a mitzvah on the go'alei hadam. He's referencing the Avengers. The Avengers is not just a Marvel comic strip or movie. It's mentioned in the Torah that there's a go'el hadam. The Avengers are the person who is murdered to go after the murderer. This is why the person who kills accidentally goes to the city of refuge, the Ir Miklat, to avoid the go'el hadam. And he says you should bring a case to whatever you can to avenge the murder of someone. Down the line, it may lead to autopsy. That's not your concern. You want justice. Justice can lead the way. He sees achieving justice as a compelling reason, even if it leads to nivul hames. Doesn't say about autopsies lichatchila. Obviously, he doesn't want that, but he's willing to risk what may likely be an autopsy in order to achieve justice. So, an opposing view is from Rabbi Natan Leifer in Seal Nefesh Chaya. As a matter of practice, I am afraid to permit the autopsy because we can make the distinction that only with respect to the vengeance of death does the victim waive his honor, but not with respect to other punishments. As it is written, the land will not have atonement for the blood that was spilled in it, except through the blood of the one who spilled it. So, while Rabbi Tannenbaum invokes this idea of the Avengers avenging the murder of their kinsmen, Rabbi Leiter says, no, that's only if they're going to execute the murderer. He invokes the verse in Bamidbar that talks about this. The only way that you really can achieve justice is if the murderer pays for his crime by being executed. And so unless you can ensure that that would be the end result of this process of investigation and digging up and autopsying, he would be opposed to that. So you see kind of an evolving scenario. No autopsy. It's okay to lead to an autopsy. You don't want to go in that direction towards autopsy. Rabbi Chiel Michal to Kaczynski says, and now we're getting into the 20th century. Source number 9. It only applies in the general case of a dead body where the death was natural. Where the death was not natural, but via an accident, where we are compelled to conduct an autopsy in order to ascertain the cause of the accident, who is responsible for it, who caused the accident. And in many cases, the investigation is relevant to the deceased and his heirs, since this is the law of the government. Not only is there a place to attempt to prevent this, but it does not entail that much of a disgrace, because this is the custom established by the government for all such corpses. So here we have Rabbi Tukachinsky being more open to the possibility, especially if it's the law of the land. He is also guided by the types of the autopsies, maybe not entailing that much of a disgrace, and seeing this as a situation where not just stop, not just in an ordinary fashion, but where it's not natural, where there's an accident, where there's a need, maybe there needs to be an investigation. Maybe we're going to see that maybe there's for insurance purposes. Maybe there's just like the original Talmudic discussion of this was concerning monetary loss. Maybe you need to do it so that the insurance will be paid out, or they won't pay it out unless they can determine the cause of death, which requires some form of autopsy. Rabbi Chiel Michal Tukachinsky opens up the possibilities, again, with the caveat that it not be a major disgrace, but this be something that is at least more recognized than not. Just so stop any questions, comments, as we see kind of a shifting approach to these types of autopsies to investigate, whether to investigate a crime or investigate a cause of death in cases of need. So, as can be expected, not everyone agrees with Rabbi Tukachinsky. Not everyone is willing to be so passive in this type of a situation. Rabbi Eliyahu Kalatzin, who's writing also, he's writing again, he's earlier than Rabbi Tukachinsky. When a person has been killed and the relatives attempt to prevent an autopsy, and by doing so they sometimes cause the murder to be hidden and the murder not to be punished through the justice system, for this they are acting in violation of halacha. You see, he's saying if it's a criminal investigation, you can't stop it. In fact, if you try and stop it, then you're doing the wrong thing. It is obvious that the deceased acquiesces to this disgracing and wants his murderer to be punished. Right? He wants it to happen this way. On the contrary, one should aid the officials of the government to clarify the matter and to punish through the justice system. You want to help facilitate, right? So you try to look at our headline through this prism, and you have Rabbi Tukachinsky in a sense allowing it, and you have Rabbi Kalatzkin encouraging it. But then you have the alternate view. The alternate view in source number 11, Rabbi Moshe David Wilner, one of the rabbis in Israel. I don't remember if it was Ashdod or Ashkelon. What honor is there for the deceased in this that the murderer is caught? Right? Who cares? That's not the person's dead. And with regard to the mitzvah, you shall destroy the evil. And if you want to make a claim that the reason to find the murderer is the expression of ubiarta hara, you want to eliminate evil, a verse in the Torah. Yeah, but we say that the dead are no longer obligated in mitzvot, right? We say that among the dead who are free, metim chafshim, they're free of mitzvot. So if you want to say it's a good thing to get rid of evil, that's a Torah value. Well, the person is dead and he no longer is worried about Torah values. It's a terrible thing. The person is dead, but let dead men lie. Right? There's no good reason to reopen a grave. There's no good reason to do an autopsy. It's a horrible thing, but there's no reason to go further. So you have various approaches. Those that are more open towards heading in the direction, even if it leads to autopsy. Those who would even permit an autopsy may be more open to it. And you have those who certainly say that this is if this is what is needed to get to justice, then it becomes almost a mitzvah, and it becomes sinful to get in the way. Questions or comments before we pivot a little bit more to medical or scientific autopsy? It's unmute if you have a question.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So, when in the case of murder, they have to just the exterior or the external physical evidence is not enough.
It could depend. Depends. It would depend. I haven't watched enough CSI to be an expert,
Right.
but sometimes you need to dig a little deeper. And sometimes it's sometimes some cases of person's poisoned. I can use my imagination. It would be completely amateur, but the that's in situations where the law triggers an autopsy, right? And I think some of these criminal cases or damaging cases trigger it. Then that's where some of these discussions would factor in. And some of it is, again, some are more open, some see this as less nivul, as less I guess desecratory, and obviously the intrusive nature of that. Is it an external observation? Is it how far deep are they going in? I think that again, what we may have read about or seen or in popular culture of taking out all the organs and weighing them and stuff like that doesn't necessarily have to be every single situation. And I think that that's also shaped Rabbi Tukachinsky in particular, who's living at a time when they're starting to talk about the role of cadavers. We're going to pivot to that in a second, but the idea of there being more of a familiarity for what this type of examination, that can lead to desecration of the remains is about, that it's not just messing up the body. And when you have a better appreciation of that, maybe you have a more of a permissive approach. Again, if you don't trust the people who want to do it, then maybe you have a more prohibitive approach. Mm-hmm. Right? I think especially you comparing, a Rabbi Tukachinsky and a Rabbi Kalatsky with a Rabbi Wilner, who says, "Come on, what's the purpose?" And that Rabbi Wilner thrust seems to be, what you see in the protests, whether it be the ones a couple of weeks ago or the ones 60 years ago. That there's this, just opposition of, let it lie.
Okay.
But the other type of autopsy is that type of situation of science, right? We know that in medical schools there's a cadaver, and what about situations moving away from the criminal? Like, so if someone passes away suddenly at a very young age, like the case here, don't you want to find out why? Maybe it's something that could impact other people. So there are a couple of different areas that are discussed, and one of the areas that were the jumping off point of, especially if it's a medical or scientific autopsy or examination of a cadaver, isn't that required? Isn't that somehow pikuach nefesh related? We know pikuach nefesh will violate whatever is necessary except for the 3 cardinal sins in order to save a life. So, if doctors to be trained and to be able to save lives, well, they need to have this knowledge, and to get this knowledge, they have to dissect and to dissect unique cadavers. So, what about the activity involved in that would seem to be understandably related to their pikuach nefesh, right? And but what about donating one's body to science to help facilitate with that pikuach nefesh, or Jewish cadavers being used, or how does that work? Israeli medical schools, and so even if Jewish law doesn't necessarily extend the same way for nivel hameis to non-Jews, right? They don't have the same responsibilities or obligations that we do. Especially going back to that first source of Rabbi Weil saying, "Look, open up the complaint. Who knows where it's going to lead? It's not our problem. The non-Jews will take it over from there." So, what about, how far can a Jew get involved, and how far does this pikuach nefesh argument extend? So, for example, there are those rabbinic authorities who extend the pikuach nefesh allowance to, look, doctors need the best training possible, and that may mean violating some laws, and that's okay. This comes up especially with regards to Shabbos in doctors working on Shabbos, or within doctors having residencies. Do they have to seek residencies that are explicitly Shomer Shabbos, or can they take the scheduling risk that sometimes they'll have to be on call on a Shabbos, right? Doctors don't have a blanket exemption, right? Doctors only when they're when it relates to their ability to be engaged in life-saving activities. Well, sometimes that requires breaking Shabbos, but sometimes it doesn't. So how do you balance the two? And often something that everyone agrees to is that if it helps facilitate better saving of life, then we should open up the we should open up the possibility. So here too, how do we look at these types of autopsies as it pertains to? So as can be imagined, you had some more restrictive and more open approaches, and I think similar to the way we saw with autopsies in reaction to criminal investigations. You have those who say, look, if you'd like to argue that an autopsy of someone who unfortunately dies suddenly, you want to try and investigate why, because maybe they have some sort of disease that we can then treat the family members in case they may have that disease also. Some rabbis would say that's too far removed. And we talk about pikuach nefesh, saving a life. You talk about safek pikuach nefesh, you might save a life. But how far does that extend? And some would say, when you talk about how far does that extend? It extends all the way. So in the case, in terms of doing the autopsy on the person who unfortunately passes away suddenly at a young age for no apparent reason, we got to do it no matter what, because who knows what the impact could be. And others would say, think back to our situation, the headline that started this. No, right? He wasn't feeling well. He wasn't in the greatest health in general. There's no reason to take this any further. And in particular, this came up with in regards to medical schools, and was discussed already in the 1700s. It became a much more pronounced conversation in Israel, with Jewish medical schools in a Jewish state. So one approach is Rabbi Ben Zion Meir Chai Uziel, who was the Sephardic chief rabbi of Israel, source number 12. Regarding what he wrote at the end of his words, that if so, we should perform an autopsy on all corpses. The worry that if you start doing something, you'll always do it. Certainly, this is a sufficient argument not to issue a blanket allowance. It shouldn't be perfectly permissible. But in the case of a known disease, which doctors do not understand, and they wish to learn from this case through an autopsy, and all the more so in a place where Jewish doctors cannot study medicine without performing autopsies, it is certainly entirely permissible to perform an autopsy, with the extra precaution not to act in a disgraceful or lightheaded manner. You see Rabbi Uziel, going down that path of, look, you need to understand things for scientific purpose, which might save lives. Fake, there's enough, you do it. But again, do it in as respectful a manner as possible. In terms of respectful manner as possible, I'm not aware of the inner workings of, say, a coroner's office or a lab, but I would imagine some cases are treated more respectfully than others. John Doe with no relatives versus, someone who has that attention. So Rabbi Uziel is saying, look, we have a chance to explore scientifically, and we need to do so. Just do it respectfully. Furthermore, Rabbi Eliezer Waldenberg, the Tzitz Eliezer, who was one of the rabbis in Israel in the 20th century, who was set the bar for a lot of the discussions in medical halacha, and addresses this issue. Source 13. Regarding an autopsy for the sake of pathology in a case where the cause of death is unknown, and the matter touches upon punishment, whether or not to convict the accused, there's room to allow it. Right, so he sees there's room to allow it. He doesn't say do it, room to allow it. Again, the more perversive view. We should allow an autopsy if the deceased died from some illness that we still do not fully understand, so that we can cure it. All that has been said applies to autopsies performed in the cases of unusual illnesses, the nature of which is still not understood, and immediately following the observation and study, everything is restored to the body in the ground for eternal rest. Again, that idea of respect. It is absolutely forbidden to hold on to the bodies of Jews for an extended period of time, and not bring them to burial in order to use them to train doctors in general medical practices. He says, in a direct situation in front of us where we can explore it is one thing, but not to have Jewish cadavers. A sailor waiver before the deceased died is of no avail. If we are dealing with the honor of God, the honor of the entire house of Israel, and there's no authority in the world that can waive this. So you see Rabbi Waldenberg, see where there's toelis, where there's a need, where there's benefit to do it respectfully, but not in general. That's not the training of doctors and the like is not good, and you can't donate your body to science. That's not enough, because there's no authority in the world that can waive this, going against what Jewish law requires of proper burial. Rabbi Shlomo Gorin took this a little bit. He was more permissive than Rabbi Waldenberg, even on the cadaver front. And here he invokes the idea that, all things being equal, Rabbi Waldenberg is right. They weren't addressing each other, but conceptually, all things being equal, Rabbi Waldenberg is right. However, there's something more on the line here. Source number 14. In our case, when the state and the nation are responsible for the continuity of medical service in Israel and for the health of the people living in the country, and we know from the outset that in another few years we'll need a certain number of doctors of high caliber in order to ensure the health of the people. And if we do not maintain medical schools, the country will be left without doctors. It's clear to us that without autopsies performed, the medical schools will not be able to produce doctors worthy of that name. This is called that the sick person is before us, since the Jewish state is responsible for the health of the population and must plan its services for the long term. He sees there that the fact having cadavers on hand is essential, not just later on, but right now, because if we're not preparing to have adequately trained doctors, then people are going to die. It's a much more direct causative relationship in that, and therefore, while Rabbi Waldenberg does not allow for cadavers to donate one's body to science, Rabbi Gorin sees a reason that if you need cadavers, you need cadavers, because you have to have the pipeline of trained medical professionals in order to treat the illnesses. If that requires cadavers, then that's considered a type of a chola bifanenu, the sick person requiring our full attention, even setting aside Jewish law, is right now in front of us, and we have to take advantage of the situation. Do we, also the idea, I guess, not addressed directly by Rabbi Gorin here, this idea of, does that mean should Israeli medical schools just be looking for non-Jewish cadavers? That might not also be a tenable situation. I'm not as familiar with how things are done in Israeli medical schools, but you see Rabbi Waldenberg would be opposed, and Rabbi Gorin has a permissive path, with regard to this. And again, in particular, both of them, but Rabbi Gorin explicitly mentions this idea of the concern that we would have for that we now have, because we have a Jewish state where Jews are responsible for the well-being and health of everyone. How are we going to take care of that without being a little bit flexible? And so, I think that the approach to autopsies or the willingness, definitely has evolved over time, certainly reaching its apex, I guess, in terms of a state of Israel. But at other junctures in history, whether it be filing a complaint that might lead to an autopsy, or being involved to try and achieve justice, and even facilitating that autopsy or being more permissive of it, as autopsies became more common and maybe even more respectful, seeing a little bit more of an opening towards allowing it, as we saw with Rabbi Tukachinsky and Rabbi Kalatskin, or those who still maintain kind of a full stop. The person's dead, it's over, as expressed by Rabbi Wilner, leading to the Haredi opposition today. And then in science, seeing in Pikuach Nefesh how far that gets extended as being as a pressing issue right now. And a state of Israel may be opening up a whole other discussion as to what can generate needs for setting aside the full respect of the body in order to do Nivel Hames, that a Jewish state may put us in a different halachic situation that Rabbi Gorin references. So, much ado was made about autopsies, and there is a lot to discuss in terms of, with regard to autopsies, in terms of specifically the halachos, as well as the culture, as well as how things have evolved, society in general, and a Jewish state in particular.